In the dead of night, a fire broke out in the small home of a black family. The flames quickly consumed everything in their path. The boy, a young child no more than 8 years old, had been sleeping soundly in his room, unaware of the danger that was creeping ever closer. His father, who had been downstairs, heard the first crackle of fire and rushed up the stairs, his heart racing with fear. When he reached his son's room, the sight before him was like something out of a nightmare. The entire room was already engulfed, the heat was unbearable. But he knew he had to act quickly. Without a second thought, he burst through the door and grabbed his son, who was now screaming in terror. The boy was disoriented and scared, but his father pulled him close and wrapped him in his arms. He quickly darted toward the window, desperate to escape the flames. The smoke was thick and choking, but the father did not falter. He grabbed his son tightly and jumped out of the window with one last burst of strength, landing hard on the ground outside. He quickly got up, dragging his son with him, his heart pounding as he looked back at the house, which was now fully ablaze. The father looked down at his son, who was crying and trembling in his arms. His face was burned, the skin raw and blistered from the intense heat, but there was no time to waste. He pulled his son closer and ran down the street, shouting for help at the top of his lungs, hoping that someone would hear them and call an ambulance. No one appeared to be around. It was like the whole world had shut down in those moments. His mind raced in desperation. Where was the nearest hospital? Where could he take his son for help? He barely noticed the sirens in the distance as he continued to run, feeling as though time was slipping away faster than he could keep up. When he reached the first house, he banged on the door, hoping for someone to answer. Finally, a woman opened the door and gasped when she saw the boy's condition. She immediately called 911, and the ambulance arrived just moments later. As the paramedics worked to stabilize the boy, the father could feel his chest tightening with panic. But there was no time for fear now. They loaded the boy into the ambulance and the father climbed in beside him. The ride to the hospital was excruciatingly slow. Every second felt like an eternity as the boy continued to moan in pain. His father's hands were stained with his son's blood, the heat from the burns still radiating off his skin. The father kept whispering words of reassurance to his son, but even he could hardly believe what was happening. How had this nightmare become their reality? The sound of the siren seemed to echo in his ears as he stared at his son, whose once bright eyes were now dull with pain. They arrived at the hospital, and the father rushed inside, clutching his son tightly, his heart pounding as he prayed for someone to help his boy. He could feel his son's tiny body shivering in his arms, and the only thing on his mind was saving him. But little did he know the nightmare was far from over, and the battle for his son's life had only just begun. The hospital was a blur of lights and sounds. The father barely noticed the staff rushing around him as he clutched his son tighter, his mind consumed with worry and fear for the boy's life. He could feel the weight of his son's burns growing heavier with every passing second, and yet the world around him seemed to move in slow motion. The paramedics wheeled them into the emergency room and immediately began shouting orders to the hospital staff. The father stood back for a moment, his eyes never leaving his son's battered face. The boy was barely conscious, his breaths shallow and labored. Every second felt like an eternity as the doctors began to examine the boy. His hands were trembling from the strain of holding it all together. The sight of his son in so much pain was unbearable, and the father couldn't help but feel the overwhelming weight of helplessness pressing down on him. One of the nurses tried to speak to him, but he barely registered her words. His mind was consumed with his son's condition. He could see the worry in the faces of the medical staff, but still no one seemed to move fast enough. His son's body was in crisis, and the clock was ticking with every second that passed. The father's anger began to rise. The fear he had felt earlier now turned into a raw, burning frustration. Why wasn't anyone doing anything to help his son? Why was everything moving so slowly? As the father stood by watching the doctors and nurses work, he could feel his blood boiling when a cold voice broke through the chaos. It was the doctor, a man who looked too calm, too indifferent. As he walked into the room and assessed the boy with a detached glance, the father could see it in his eyes. There was no care, no sense of urgency. There was no empathy in his gaze. The doctor barely acknowledged the father as he began to speak speak about the boy's burns, but his words were cold and clinical. He mentioned something about limited resources and needing to prioritize other patients. The father couldn't believe his ears. He leaned forward, his heart pounding with a mix of confusion and fury. His son was suffering in front of him, and this doctor was treating him like a number on a list. The father's voice cracked as he demanded the doctor do something, anything to help his son, but the doctor merely shrugged and made excuses for why treatment couldn't begin immediately. The father could feel his fists clenching, his stomach churning with disbelief. He couldn't understand how anyone could be so callous, so indifferent to the suffering of his child. The boy's cries grew louder, and the father's patience snapped. He turned to the doctor with a fierce glare and demanded again that he start treatment immediately, but the doctor's response was even worse, his words cold and final: "We don't have the facilities for such serious burns," and he made it clear that due to the boy's race, they were not prioritized. The father stood frozen in shock, for a moment unable to comprehend what he was hearing. The doctor's racism was undeniable, and it crushed him more deeply than anything else ever could. He felt a wave of anger surge through him. His son was fighting for his life, and this doctor had just condemned him without a second thought. His blood boiled, and the world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only his son's pain and his own growing rage. The father's mind raced in a whirlwind of disbelief and fury. He couldn't understand how this was happening. His son was barely holding on, and the man who was supposed to help was turning them away with a coldness that felt inhuman. The doctor's words echoed in his ears: "We don't have the facilities for such serious burns," and due to the boy's race, they weren't prioritizing him. The father's chest tightened with rage. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he looked at his son, whose eyes were barely open, his tiny body shaking in his arms. The boy had been through hell tonight, and now it seemed like the world was against him. At that moment, everything within the father snapped. He had never felt such a surge of anger and helplessness in his entire life. His son's life was on the line, and this doctor, this racist individual, was treating him like an inconvenience. The father's fists clenched at his sides, his mind filled with images of the doctor's smug face and the cruel words he had spoken. How could anyone be so heartless? The father took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the anger wouldn't subside. His son needed help now, and this doctor was refusing to give it. After everything they had been through, the father couldn't just stand by and let his son suffer. He stepped forward, his voice trembling with fury as he demanded that the doctor do something. He raised his voice, pleading for his son to be treated. The doctor didn't even look up from his clipboard. His indifference only stoked the fire of the father's rage. His son was in agony, and this man was ignoring them like they didn't matter. The father felt his stomach churn as the weight of what was happening sank in. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't just a delay. This was racism. It was the coldest, most blatant racism he had ever witnessed, and it was happening to his son. His mind raced with thoughts of how to make this right, how to make sure no one would ever treat his boy like this again. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to gather his thoughts. The emergency room doors swung open, and the father stepped into the hallway, his breath ragged. He paced back and forth, a storm of emotions swirling within him. He had never felt so powerless, but he couldn't let his son die in this hospital. He couldn't let that doctor's racism be the reason his child didn't make it. He had to do something. The father's mind was consumed with the need for justice. He wasn't going to let this go. He was going to make sure the world knew what had happened to his son, and that no one would ever treat a child like this again. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every passing second, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now, not when his son needed him the most. He took a deep breath and made his decision. He was going to make the hospital answer for what had just happened. No one would get away with this injustice. No one. The father stood in the hallway, his hands shaking as he fought to control the storm of emotions within him. He could still hear the boy's soft cries coming from the emergency room, and it was all he could do to not turn back and demand the doctor treat his son immediately. But he knew he had to be strategic. The weight of what had just happened was too heavy to ignore. He needed to make sure this injustice didn't go unnoticed, and he couldn't afford to lose control now, not when his son's life hung in the balance. He paced back and forth the hallway, feeling his heart race with every passing second. Time was slipping away, but he knew he had to act fast. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the doctor's cold eyes, The words he had spoken, the racism dripping from every syllable, it was unbearable to think that someone could treat a child like that simply because of his skin color. His hands balled into fists as he thought of the years of injustice he had faced as a black man, and now his son was being subjected to the same thing. He could feel his body trembling with rage and grief. But he refused to let the tears fall. He had to remain strong for his son, for the fight that lay ahead. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the nearest nurse station. He couldn't stand idly by any longer. He needed to make sure that the hospital understood the gravity of what had just occurred. The nurse behind the desk looked up at him with concern in her eyes, and he could see the hesitation in her gaze. But he didn't have time for hesitation, not when his son's life was at stake. He walked up to her and asked to speak with the hospital administrator, his voice steady but firm. He explained that he needed to report a serious issue, something that couldn't be ignored. Not this time. The nurse's expression shifted from concern to confusion, and she seemed unsure of how to respond. But the father was relentless. He didn't care about her confusion. He didn't care about the bureaucracy or the politics of the situation. All he cared about was his son's survival and the injustice they had just endured. The nurse reluctantly picked up the phone and dialed a number. As the father waited, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he refused to back down. He was doing this for his son. He had to do this. The administrator arrived a few minutes later, a middle-aged man in a suit who looked more interested in paperwork than in the situation at hand. The father wasted no time. He recounted the events that had just occurred, his voice shaking but resolute. He told the administrator everything about the doctor's refusal to treat his son and the blatant racism that had been on display. The administrator listened in silence, but the father could tell that he was starting to understand the seriousness of what had happened. When the father finished speaking, the administrator finally looked up at him, his face somber and apologetic. But the father wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted action. He demanded that the hospital take immediate steps to address what had just happened, that no child should ever face such treatment again. The administrator promised that the situation would be investigated and assured the father that they would take the necessary steps. But the father wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He had a fire inside him, now a fire that wouldn't be extinguished until the doctor was held accountable and his son received the care he deserved. The father stepped away from the administrator, his mind still spinning with anger and disbelief. He could hear the sound of the boy's cries from the emergency room, and it only fueled the fire within him. He knew that the investigation into the doctor's actions would take time, but he couldn't stand by and wait any longer. His son was still in pain, and the doctor's racism had been allowed to go unchallenged for far too long. He turned back to the nurse at the desk, his voice calm but fierce as he demanded to know what was being done to ensure his son was receiving proper care. He didn't want to hear excuses. He didn't want to hear that they were understaffed or overwhelmed. He wanted action. He had made it clear to the administrator, and now he was going to make sure that his son wasn't forgotten in the chaos of the hospital's bureaucracy. The nurse looked at him with a mix of pity and fear, as if she wasn't sure what he might do next. But the father stood firm, his eyes locked on hers. As he waited for an answer, the nurse hesitated before speaking. Slowly and carefully, she explained that they were waiting for another doctor to come in to take over the boy's care. But the father wasn't satisfied with this answer. He could feel his blood boiling with frustration. His son was lying in that room in excruciating pain, and they were waiting for another doctor to come in, as if his son's life wasn't urgent enough. He felt a surge of anger rising in him, but he fought to keep his composure. He couldn't let himself lose control, not now, not when his son needed him more than ever. He took a deep breath and walked away from the nurse's desk, his mind racing with the knowledge that he had to keep pushing. He couldn't let the hospital's apathy take another moment of his son's life away. He needed to make his voice heard and ensure that no other child would have to suffer because of racism like his son had. The father paced through the halls of the hospital, his footsteps heavy on the tile floor, each one marking the time that had passed and the time that was slipping away with each breath his son took, he could still see the boy's face in his mind, the burns that marred his skin, the pain that twisted his features. He knew his son was strong, but the father also knew that this battle wasn't just about physical survival, it was about something bigger. It was about the fight against a system that allowed racism to thrive. It was about ensuring that his son's future was not determined by the color of his skin. It was about sending a message that this kind of treatment would never be tolerated again. He knew the fight ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready for it. He wasn't going to back down no matter how difficult it got. The father stopped in front of the door to the ER. He stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling with each breath as he gathered the strength he needed to walk back inside. He could hear his son's voice, growing weaker, but he couldn't let that be the last memory he had of this night. He pushed the door open and walked back into the room. His son's eyes fluttered open, and the father could see the pain and confusion in his face. But there was also a glimmer of trust, a glimmer of hope, that his father would fix this, that he would make things right. The father squeezed his son's hand and whispered to him everything would be okay. He would make sure of it. He would make sure that no one would ever make his son feel less than again. The father stood beside his son's bed, his heart aching, as he watched the boy's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The boy was struggling to stay conscious, his face pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. The father's resolve grew stronger. He couldn't allow the situation to continue. His son had been mistreated in the most unforgivable way, and now he was going to make sure the hospital and the doctor were held accountable for their actions. He stepped out of the room again, this time with a newfound determination. He wasn't going to leave this hospital until his son was treated with the dignity and care he deserved. His mind was set on the task ahead. He had seen injustice before, but this was different. This was a direct assault on his child, and he wasn't going to let it slide without a fight. He marched down the hall toward the administration office, his steps quick and purposeful, each one a declaration that he would not be silenced, that his son would not be silenced. His pulse quickened as he approached the office, and he could feel the eyes of the staff on him as he passed them. His presence was undeniable. As he reached the door to the administrator's office, he didn't hesitate for a moment. He opened it without knocking and stepped inside. The administrator looked up, startled by the intrusion, but the father wasted no time. He walked straight to the desk and slammed his hand down on it, the sound reverberating through the room. The administrator looked at him wide-eyed, but the father's gaze was unyielding, his voice low but full of power, as he demanded to know what was being done to investigate the doctor's actions. The administrator stammered for a moment, trying to compose himself, but the father wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't interested in the hospital's protocols or the politics of the situation. He wanted justice for his son. He wanted that doctor fired, and he wanted it done now. The administrator assured him that the situation was being taken seriously, but the father could see the hesitation in his eyes. The man wasn't moving fast enough. The father wasn't going to wait for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn. Not when his son was still suffering. He was done waiting. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the office. His thoughts were racing with the urgency of the moment. The hospital might not act fast enough, but he could make sure they would feel the consequences of their inaction. He didn't care about the personal consequences for him. He cared only about making sure that no child would face the same cruelty his son had faced that night. He would make it his mission to make sure this story was heard far and wide, so that the doctor's actions could never be ignored again. He would make sure that this moment would stand as a turning point in the hospital's history, and he would make sure that his son's life was valued above all else. The father walked back into the ER waiting room, where a few people had gathered. He could see the faces of the staff as they glanced at him nervously, and he knew that they had already begun to hear whispers of what had transpired. The word was spreading, and he intended to make sure it spread faster. He was no longer just a concerned father. He was an advocate for his son. He was a voice for anyone who had ever been denied the care they deserved because of the color of their skin. His son's pain had sparked something inside him, something that would not be extinguished until justice was served. The father moved through the hospital like a man possessed, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. As he walked past nurses and doctors, he could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't care anymore. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. His son's pain was real, his son's suffering was real, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget that. He knew the hospital had a duty to care for everyone who walked through its doors, regardless of their race, but it was clear that this wasn't just about medical treatment. This was about standing up for what was right. This was about confronting a system that allowed people to be treated as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. He could feel the heat rising inside of him with every step. The hospital was like a maze of sterile walls and cold floors, but it was a place that had failed his son. The father didn't care about the hierarchy, the politics, or the people who would try to quiet his voice. He wasn't going to stop until he saw real change. He marched back to the ER room, where his son lay in pain. And this time he wasn't just going to wait for answers, he was going to demand them. When he entered the room, he saw the new doctor who had arrived, the one who had been assigned to replace the racist doctor. The father could see the concern in the new doctor's eyes, and for a moment he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe this time things would be different. The doctor quickly assessed his son's condition and immediately began preparing to treat the burns. The father stood there watching intently, his eyes never leaving his son's face. The boy was barely conscious, his tiny body trembling, but the father could see the doctor working quickly and with purpose. As the burns were cleaned and the pain was slowly eased away, he knew the road ahead would still be long. His son would need more treatment and care. But for the first time in hours, he felt a sense of relief that the boy was finally receiving the attention he needed. The father's emotions were still raw, but the anger that had fueled him earlier was now mixed with something else, a feeling of determination. As he looked at his son's face, he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for him when it mattered most, and he had made sure the world knew the truth about what had happened in that hospital. He could see the boy's eyes flutter open as the pain began to subside, and the father gently stroked his hair, whispering words of reassurance that everything was going to be okay. He felt the boy squeeze his hand weakly, and he knew in that moment that they had both made it through the storm. The new doctor glanced over at him and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The father felt a sense of gratitude. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet. He had made sure that the first battle was won. But he would not rest until the doctor who had refused to treat his son was held accountable for his actions. The word had already spread through the hospital. The racist doctor's actions were no longer a secret, and the backlash was beginning to build. It wasn't just the father's voice that would be heard now, it was the voices of everyone who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. In a place that was supposed to heal, the father felt the fire inside of him burning even brighter. He was ready for whatever came next. He would not back down. The father sat beside his son in the quiet of the ER room, his hand still holding his boy's. As the new doctor worked diligently to treat the burns, the boy's pain had eased, and his breathing had become less labored. The father could feel the exhaustion in his own body, but it was a different kind of tiredness. It was the exhaustion of a fight fought and not yet finished. But for now he could see the relief on his son's face, and he knew they had made it through the worst of it. He glanced up at the new doctor, who had been nothing but professional since arriving. The doctor seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and moved quickly to make sure the boy was stabilized. But the father couldn't shake the anger that still burned within him. He had done everything he could to ensure his son was treated properly, but the doctor who had rejected him was still out there, walking free. No apology, no consequence, nothing had been done yet. The father had no intention of letting this matter rest. He couldn't. He had already fought too hard and too long for his son's care to let a moment of complacency undo everything he had just endured. He stood up from his chair as his son slept peacefully for the first time in hours. He walked back out into the hall and found the administrator once again waiting at his desk. The man's face still had a hint of discomfort from the earlier confrontation, but the father was past pleasantries. This was no longer about polite requests or formalities. He needed action. He needed accountability. He marched up to the desk and demanded to know why nothing had been done about the racist doctor. He could feel the weight of his words land with force. The administrator looked up at him with uncertainty, as if weighing his options. But the father wasn't interested in hesitation. Not now, not when the stakes were so high. The administrator explained that the investigation was underway, But the father wasn't satisfied with this response. He had seen how quickly the hospital had acted when they realized the public implications of what had happened. He had seen the whispers between staff and the nervous looks exchanged. He knew the system could move fast when it wanted to, and now it needed to move for his son and for every other patient who had been subjected to the same cruelty. He knew the hospital was under pressure and that their reputation was on the line, but his son's life was not some collateral damage in a PR campaign. It was a human life at stake, and it had been wronged. The father didn't leave the administrator's office until he had concrete assurances that the doctor would face serious consequences. He demanded that the hospital take swift action and that the doctor be removed from any further treatment responsibilities until the investigation was complete. It was a matter of principle and dignity, and he wasn't going to let anyone undermine that. The administrator reluctantly agreed, but the father could see that the man was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The father didn't leave the hospital until he had a promise in writing that the doctor would be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. As he walked back to his son's room, the father finally felt a sense of relief washing over him. His son had been treated and was stable, and now the wheels of justice were in motion. He sat back down beside his boy, his hand still wrapped around the small fragile one. He looked down at his son's peaceful face and whispered softly, "This fight wasn't over, but for tonight they had won."